They brought him in chains, not real chains, of course. The Galactic Council had too much class for that. They called it a diplomatic escort, which was a polite way of saying that the human had no choice in the matter. The same way I had no choice in the matter. And the same way our entire civilization had no choice in anything anymore. Choice had become a luxury we could not afford. And I hated that more than I could say. My name is Velerin. I am a senior biogeneticist of the Zerathi people, holder of the third flame of the Lineage Council, the youngest researcher in 400 years to be named a carrier of sacred sequence. I say this not to boast. I say it so you understand exactly how far I fell when I stood before the High Matriarch and told her, in front of the full council, in front of the ancient banners of our dead queens, that I refused. I refused the program. I refused the human. I stood in the Hall of Continuance with my spine straight and my bioluminescent markings burning a cold, proud silver, and I said no. Not quietly. Not with apology. I said it the way our people are supposed to say everything, which is with total certainty and no room for debate. The matriarch did not move. She is 3,000 years old and she has seen empires dissolve like salt in warm water. My refusal did not shock her, but the silence that followed it was heavy enough to crush stone. Let me explain what the hollowing is, because without it, nothing that comes after makes any sense. The hollowing began 80 years ago as a minor genetic anomaly found in a handful of Zerathi males in the northern breeding regions. The scientists at the time called it a quirk, a statistical noise, something that would correct itself in a generation. It did not correct itself. It spread. It moved through the male genetic line like a slow fire through dry grass, not burning bright and obvious, but smoldering underneath, invisible until the damage was already done. By the time I entered the field of biogenetics, the hollowing had rendered 62% of all Zerathi males biologically incapable of continuing the lineage. In the years since my certification, that number had climbed to 79%. The projections said that within 3 generations, without intervention, our population would begin a collapse we would not be able to stop. We were not dying quickly. We were dying quietly, and quiet deaths are always the cruelest kind. The Galactic Council had reviewed our genetic data, run their models, consulted their specialists, and arrived at a solution that was, from a purely biological standpoint, elegant. There was one species in the known galaxy whose base genetic architecture was compatible enough with ours to provide the necessary material for successful lineage continuation. Compatible enough, they said, as if that was a compliment. Compatible enough. Humans. The word had landed in the council chamber, like something dropped from a great height. I remembered the sound of it. I remembered the way it echoed. I remembered, most clearly, the feeling of my own markings going dim with something I did not immediately identify as shame, but which I later understood was exactly that. Humans, the species that had only discovered faster than light travel 60 years ago, the species that still argued with each other over territorial lines drawn on a single planet, the species that solved problems with their bodies before their minds, that had a documented history of nearly destroying their own world multiple times over. Humans whose lifespans were so short it almost seemed cruel, who carried their emotions so close to the surface that you could read them from across a room, who formed attachments to things as small and temporary as particular seats in rooms or specific paths through parks. Humans were what stood between my people and extinction. The indignity of it was extraordinary. The program the matriarch described was called the Continuance Accord. It was voluntary on the human side, extensively reviewed by both species medical councils, thoroughly documented, and structured with more protections and protocols than any diplomatic agreement in Zerathi history. It was, objectively, a reasonable solution to an existential crisis. I still refused it. I want to be honest about why. When I stood in that hall and said no, I told myself it was about dignity. I told myself it was about the integrity of our lineage, about the philosophical questions surrounding what it meant to carry the blood of another species inside the most sacred biological function of our civilization. Those reasons sounded correct. They felt correct. I was very good at making things feel correct. But somewhere, in the part of me that keeps the real logs, the ones I do not share with the council or the researchers, or even my closest colleagues, I knew it was also something else. Something smaller. Something I was not ready to name yet. The matriarch did not argue with me that day. She did not raise her voice or invoke her authority, or threaten my position. She simply looked at me for a long moment with those ancient gray eyes that had watched centuries fold into each other. And she said 3 things. She said that my refusal was noted and recorded. She said that the hollowing was accelerating beyond the original projections, and that the council had revised the threshold window to 60 standard cycles. and she said that a human liaison would be arriving aboard our research vessel the following week, as part of the initial diplomatic framework for the continuance accord, and that as senior biogeneticist, I would be responsible for his orientation and integration into the crew. I left the Hall of Continuance with my refusal still intact and a name in my file that meant nothing to me. Cale Doran, former soldier, highly decorated, voluntary participant. I looked at the file on my way back to the lab. There was a standard image, the kind the council used for all liaison profiles. He looked like what I expected a human to look like. Average height for his species, brown eyes, several visible scars on his face and neck, which told me the soldier part of his file was not ceremonial. He had the particular stillness in his expression that I recognized from studying human documentation, the look of someone who had been in situations where showing what they felt was a liability. I set the file down, a soldier playing diplomat. I thought, without any warmth, that this should be interesting to observe from a clinical distance. I thought I would watch him, document him, manage him efficiently, and continue refusing the program until the matriarch gave me a better option, or the 60 cycles ran out. I was wrong about all of it. But I did not know that yet. The research vessel Sorathven was 3 months into its current survey mission when the docking alert sounded. I was in the lower genetics lab running sequencing analysis on the latest batch of lineage viability samples, which is a clinical way of saying I was staring at data that told me, in precise numerical language, how badly we were losing. The numbers had been worsening for months. Each new sample set arrived like a quiet argument I could not refute, and I had developed the habit of staring at the results long after the analysis was finished, as if looking harder at them would make them mean something different. The docking alert meant the transport shuttle from the council relay station had arrived. It meant the human was here. I did not go to the docking bay. I sent my assistant, a young researcher named Alara, with the standard orientation packet and a list of the areas of the ship that were off-limits to non-crew personnel. I told myself this was a reasonable delegation of a minor administrative task. I told myself there was no reason for the senior biogeneticist to personally receive a diplomatic visitor. Both of these things were technically true, and both of them were also a way of buying time before I had to be in the same room as the decision I had refused. Elara came back 20 minutes later looking slightly surprised. He already knew 3 of the ship's 6 entry protocols, she said. He had memorized them from the council briefing packet, apparently, and had walked through the pressurization sequence without being prompted. She added, almost reluctantly, that he had bowed when he entered the inner corridor, the formal bow, the one visitors to a Zirathi vessel are supposed to offer, the one that takes most non-Zirathi several awkward attempts to get right, and even then usually only approximate. He had not approximated it. He had done it correctly. I told Alara that she was easily impressed, and I went back to my sequencing data, but I noted the detail. I noted it the way a scientist notes something that does not fit neatly into the existing model, not with alarm, just with attention. I met him formally the next morning in the briefing room at the center of the vessel. These meetings are standard protocol for all new personnel, and I had conducted dozens of them. I knew how to run one efficiently, how to cover the necessary information without wasting time, how to keep things professional and appropriately brief. I was good at this. I was good at most things I put my mind to, which is something I am allowed to say because it is accurate. He was already seated when I entered, which surprised me. Visitors typically arrived after the senior staff member, as a matter of hierarchy. He was seated with a small notebook open in front of him, and he was writing in it, with a pen, an actual physical pen. I had not seen someone use a physical pen in a very long time. He looked up when I came in and he stood, and he inclined his head in the secondary acknowledgement gesture that Zirathi use for a professional superior in a scientific setting. He had done his reading. I sat down across from him and looked at him directly, the way we look at subjects we are assessing. He did not look away, and he did not look uncomfortable. He just looked back, with the same calm attention he might have given a map or a piece of data he was trying to understand. Brown eyes, 2 scars, one along the jaw and one through the left eyebrow, both old and well-healed. A steadiness in his face that I immediately identified as controlled rather than natural, which meant it was practiced, which meant there had been a time when he needed to practice being still. I said what I always said in these meetings, that I was here to outline the operational protocols for his time aboard the vessel, that I expected compliance with all research zones classifications, that his access to council communications was restricted to encrypted relay only, that any biological samples or genetic data he encountered in the course of his duties were to be treated as classified under 3 separate accords. and that any questions about the continuance program specifically were to be directed to me in writing before any verbal discussion could occur. He listened. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he asked one question. He asked how long the hollowing had been affecting the primary age group of viable males. Not a question about protocols. Not a question about his schedule or his accommodations or what he was or was not allowed to do. He asked about the disease. He asked with the tone of someone who already understood the shape of a problem and was trying to measure its depth. I told him, 43 years of documented progression in the primary viability age group, with acceleration in the last 11. He nodded slowly and wrote something in his notebook. Then he said that he understood, and that he was there to help however he could be useful, and that he would try not to be a burden on the crew. I said that I expected he would try. It was not generous. I knew it was not generous even as I said it. He did not react to it except to nod again lightly, as if he had expected something like that and was not troubled by it. I left the briefing room with the strange, slightly uncomfortable feeling of someone who had aimed a precise instrument at a target and found the target much further away than calculated. 3 weeks passed. He kept to himself more than I expected. He attended the daily operational briefings, asked careful questions when he had them, and spent his free hours in the small observation deck at the stern of the vessel. Ilara told me she had found him there several nights in a row, just watching the passing star systems. She said he had seemed very quiet. I said that was fine. I said quiet was preferable to the alternative. I kept watching him. I told myself it was scientific observation of an unfamiliar species in a new environment, which was the kind of justification that sounds clean and professional and requires absolutely no self-examination. I was watching him the night the raiders came. I was in the genetics lab again, when the proximity alarm sounded. Not a navigation warning, a threat signal, which is a different sound entirely, sharper and lower at the same time. The kind of sound that does something to your nervous system regardless of how many times you hear it. I had heard it twice in my career before that night. Both times had been false alarms. This time the lights shifted to emergency amber before the alarm finished its first cycle, which meant the threat assessment system had already confirmed a real contact. The ship's intercom carried Commander Hess's voice, clipped and immediate. 3 unregistered vessels, non-council signatures, approaching on an intercept vector at high speed. They were broadcasting no identification, no diplomatic channel request, no standard approach signals. They were simply coming fast and silent, which is the universal language for bad intentions. Press ordered all non-military personnel to secure stations. That meant me and Ilara and the 12 other researchers on the science deck. I sealed the lab, activated the encrypted storage lock on all the genetic data archives, and pulled up the ship's internal camera system on my secondary screen. Press had 8 trained security officers aboard. The raiders, when they breached the outer docking clamp on the port side, came through with 14, and they came through fast. I watched on the cameras. I watched our security team try to hold the corridor at Junction 7, which is the main artery between the docking ports and the ship's core. Systems. They were good, our security team. They were trained and disciplined and they held for longer than I expected. But they were trained for internal disputes and the occasional smuggler, not for a coordinated assault by what were clearly professional mercenaries. Within 4 minutes they were pushed back to Junction 4, and the raiders were moving toward the genetics lab block and the data archive core. I became aware, watching the cameras, that Kale was no longer in his quarters. I had almost missed it because I was focused on Junction 7, but I caught the motion on a secondary camera, and my eye went to it automatically. He was moving through the maintenance corridor that runs parallel to the main junction, the one that is not on any standard ship map but that would be visible to anyone who had spent 3 weeks quietly memorizing the layout of a vessel. He was moving without hesitation, not running recklessly, moving the way water moves around obstacles, finding the fastest path through rather than straight ahead. He had something in each hand that I recognized after a moment as maintenance tools, the heavy-head kind used for hull repair, repurposed in a way that required a specific kind of imagination to arrive at. He reached the maintenance panel at Junction 6 before the raiders reached it from the main corridor. What happened next I watched with the same focused disbelief I might have felt watching a natural phenomenon I had classified as impossible until I was watching it happen. He moved through those 14 trained mercenaries with a precision that was almost geometrically clean. He did not move the way our security officers moved, which was systematically, according to training. He moved according to the situation as it was happening, adjusting in real time, reading each moment a fraction ahead of it. doing exactly enough and never more. He took a plasma discharge across his right shoulder in the middle of it. I saw him stagger. I saw him take a breath and keep moving as if the stagger had been a data point rather than an injury. When it was over, the corridor was secured. The raiders were restrained. Our security team, who had been retreating toward the core, had turned around and come back at the sound of the fighting shifting, and they arrived to find the corridor already held. Press asked, over the intercom, what had happened. One of the security officers said very simply that the human had happened. I did not go to the corridor immediately. I waited until the ship was confirmed secure, and then I went, because, as the senior medical officer with genetic biology clearance, I was also the closest thing we had to a full physician on board, and Cale's shoulder needed attention that the automated systems were not calibrated for human anatomy to provide correctly. He was sitting against the corridor wall when I arrived, and he was holding the shoulder with his other hand, and he was looking at the restraints on the raiders with the calm expression of someone reviewing a completed task. I crouched beside him and opened my kit. I did not say anything immediately. I began assessing the wound, which was a plasma burn about 4 centimeters wide at the entry point, and had already begun the kind of deep tissue damage that would worsen significantly without treatment. My hands were steady. I am always steady in clinical situations. It is one of my genuine skills. His skin was different from what I had expected, though I could not have said exactly what I had expected. Warmer, more responsive to the touch in the assessment sense, with a circulatory system that was already working hard to manage the damage, pushing blood to the site in a way that was almost aggressive in its efficiency. The human body's response to injury is remarkable. In a purely biological sense, it does not wait to be told what to do. It simply begins. I worked without speaking. He did not speak either. He watched what I was doing with that same measured attention he gave everything. And he was very still while I worked, which is harder than it sounds when the work involves a burn that I knew was causing significant pain. After a few minutes he asked, quietly, how bad it was. I told him it would heal completely. I told him the tissue response was already strong. I said, with more honesty than I intended, that his body's repair mechanism was impressive. He said that humans were good at surviving things they probably shouldn't. I did not respond immediately. I was sealing the outer layer of the wound with the regenerative compound, and I focused on doing it precisely. But something in the way he said it stayed in me. Not proudly, not as a boast, just as a fact stated the way he stated most things, which was without decoration. I asked, without looking up from the wound, what he knew about the hollowing. I did not plan to ask it. The question arrived before I had decided to ask it, which was something that happened to me rarely enough that I noticed it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had read everything the council made available. He said he understood that it was a genetic collapse moving through the male line. He said that the timeline the council briefing suggested was alarming, and that he suspected the real timeline was probably worse, based on how quickly the continuance accord had been escalated to mandatory status. He was right. The real timeline was worse, by almost a full generation. I sealed the last section of the wound and sat back on my heels and looked at him, and he looked back at me, and I said that yes, it was worse than the briefing suggested. He nodded. He said he was sorry. He said it the way someone says something they genuinely mean without knowing what else to offer. And there is a particular texture to that kind of honesty that is very difficult to dismiss regardless of how much you want to. I stood up and packed my kit and told him to report to the medical bay in the morning for a follow-up assessment. He said he would. I walked back to the lab. I sat down at my desk and opened my personal log, which I had been keeping since the first day of my career in the format of a scientific journal, precise and orderly and factual. I wrote one line. He is not what I cataloged him as. I do not know what to do with that. I did not write anything else that night. But I sat there for a long time, in the amber light of the still recovering ship, thinking about a human who had learned our formal bow from a briefing packet, who had asked the right question in the wrong order, who had held a corridor with maintenance tools and then sat against a wall asking how bad the wound was in the same tone he might use to ask about the weather. I had a category for humans. I had built it carefully over many years of academic study and professional distance. It was a thorough category. It had many accurate things in it. Cale Doran did not fit in it, and that was the most unsettling data point I had encountered in a very long time. Over the next several weeks I observed him. I was careful to call it observation, in my personal log and in my own thoughts, because observation is a professional activity with clear purpose, and what I was doing needed to have a clear purpose. He moved through the ship with a kind of thoughtful attention I had not expected. Not passive attention, The kind that is collecting information without appearing to, that is building a map quietly over time. He remembered names after one introduction. He remembered small details about the crew, things they mentioned once in passing, and he would reference them later in a way that was not calculated, not social maneuvering, just genuine retention. He had listened. He had cared enough to hold on to what he heard. Commander Hres tolerated him the way she tolerated anything she could not immediately remove, with a formal coldness that she made no effort to soften, which KL received with the same equanimity he seemed to receive everything. He did not try to win her over. He did not perform accommodation or overextend himself in gestures of goodwill. He simply continued to be exactly what he was, day after day, at a consistent level that required nothing from anyone else to sustain it. I found that confusing. I found it confusing because in my experience, that kind of consistency is either a performance or a personality, and the longer I watched him, the more certain I became that it was the latter, which raised questions I was not ready to pursue. He spent 3 evenings a week in the ship's small common area, and I began arriving there at times that were not entirely accidental. I told myself I was monitoring the integration of a non-crew member into the ship's social environment, which is a responsibility that falls within my senior role, and I repeated this to myself, with diminishing conviction over the weeks that followed. On the 14th evening I arrived and he was alone, and I sat down across from him, and he looked up from his notebook without surprise and said hello. Not my title, not my rank designation. Hello. As if we were simply two beings sharing a room. I asked him what he was writing. He said he was keeping notes on the ship's structural design. He said he found the way the Zarathi divided interior space interesting, the way personal areas were separated from functional areas by curves rather than straight walls. He said it reminded him of something he had read about the way certain Earth-sea creatures build their shells. I had not expected him to have an opinion about the architecture of our vessels. I said so. He said that people had opinions about most things if you asked them. He said that most people did not get asked. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked him about Earth, which I told myself was a data collection question, which was less than a quarter true. He talked about it in a way that was different from the council orientation materials I had reviewed, different from the political and historical summaries that made up most of what I knew about his world. He talked about a specific place he had grown up, a coastal town in the northern part of a continent called Europe, where the water was cold and the sky was almost always the color of pale gray silk, and where the people were stubborn and quiet and fiercely attached to small things, to particular fishing boats and specific pubs, and the particular way the light fell on the sea at 4 in the afternoon in October. He described it not with nostalgia, but with the tone of someone reporting something they believed to be genuinely important. I asked why those things were important. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said that humans were creatures who knew that everything they loved would eventually end, and that they chose to love it anyway, and that the specific small things were the proof of the choosing. He said, a person who loves a particular view from a particular window is someone who has decided that this view, at this time, in this light, matters, not because it is extraordinary, but because they are paying attention. I looked at him. I said that sounded like a very inefficient way to experience the world. He smiled slightly. He said it probably was, but that humans had found it to be a survival strategy anyway, in ways they did not always understand themselves. I went back to my lab that night, and I sat in front of my data, and I thought about what he had said. I thought about it longer than was clinically justified for a remark made in a common room conversation. I wrote in my log that his perspective on human attachment was worth examining further from a sociological standpoint, which was the kind of sentence I wrote when I was not ready to write the true one. The true one was that something he said had stayed in me in a way I could not account for scientifically, and that I was not sure I liked what that meant. The discovery came on a morning 3 days later, when I was reviewing the latest data from the secondary viability studies. I had been running a parallel analysis for 2 months, cross-referencing the hollowing progression with environmental and behavioral factors that the original studies had not weighted heavily. It was side work, unofficial, the kind of thing scientists do when the main conclusions feel incomplete. The results came through and I read them 3 times before I accepted what they were telling me. The hollowing was not moving through the male genetic line randomly. It was accelerating in a specific genetic subgroup, one that was identifiable by a particular enzyme marker that we had not been tracking because its connection to reproductive viability had not been established. It was a marker I recognized. I had seen it in the first viability samples I had ever processed years ago, and I had categorized it as inert and moved on. It was not inert. This changed the projection significantly. It meant the collapse timeline was not 3 generations. It was closer to 2. It also meant that the pool of viable males was smaller than the current numbers suggested, because a portion of the males currently classified as unaffected carried the enzyme marker and would begin showing viability decline within the next 15 years. I sat with this data for 2 hours. Then I wrote up the findings and filed them to the council under emergency classification. Then I did something I had not planned to do. I walked to the common area. It was mid-afternoon and I did not expect him to be there, but he was, reading from a tablet, and he looked up when I came in. I sat down. I did not say what I had just discovered. I was not ready to talk about the data yet. Instead, I said, without planning to, that I had a question for him. He set the tablet down and gave me his full attention. He did that every time. Never gave partial attention to something he had decided to engage with. I asked why he had volunteered for the continuance program. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had spent 12 years in the military and he had watched enough things be destroyed that he had started looking for things to build instead. He said that what the Zirathi were facing was something he understood in a different way than most his people, because he had watched a community he loved lose the things that made it continue, and he knew the exact shape of that kind of loss. He said that if his biology could do something useful in a situation like that, refusing it would be a kind of waste he could not justify to himself. I asked if he had been afraid to volunteer. He said yes. I asked what had made him do it anyway. He said that being afraid of something was not the same as being right to avoid it. I sat in the common room for a long time after he said that. He did not try to fill the silence. He just let it be there, which was its own kind of patience. When I left, I went back to my lab and I opened my personal log, and I did not write the scientific observation I had intended to write. I wrote something else instead. I wrote that I had spent weeks telling myself that my refusal of the program was about dignity and principle, and the integrity of our lineage. And I wrote that I was beginning to suspect I had been wrong about my own reasons. I did not elaborate. I was not ready to elaborate. But writing it down made it real in a way that thinking it had not, and I closed the log and stared at the sequencing data on my screen, and let the truth of it sit in the room with me. The morning everything changed began with a communications alert at 03440 ship time. I was already awake. I had been awake for most of the night, working through the enzyme marker analysis, trying to find a way to make the projections less alarming than they were. The analysis kept arriving at the same conclusion. I had started to accept that the numbers were simply telling me the truth. The alert was from the ship's long-range detection array. Commander Hess was on the bridge within minutes, and I pulled up the tactical feed in my lab, which I had access to by virtue of the data archive lock system being tied to my clearance. 4 ships, larger than the 3 that had come before. Same non-council signature profile, same approach vector, same silence on all communication channels. But these had something the first group had not. They had detailed technical specifications of the Sorath Ven's layout in their navigation data, which our system detected when they attempted a targeted docking approach at the exact location of the genetics lab block. They had inside information. Someone had sold them the ship's schematics. Someone had told them exactly where to find what they were looking for. Press sealed all decks and activated the full military alert. She had 8 officers and a human liaison on a research vessel that was not built for sustained combat. And what was coming at us was a professional extraction force with specific intelligence and 4 ships. The math was obvious and it was terrible. I sealed the archive. I activated the triple-layer encryption that would make the genetic data unreadable to any system without my direct biological authorization. The data could not be taken, but the ship could still be taken, and the crew with it, and I stood in the middle of my lab with the amber emergency lights turning everything the color of old fire, and I thought, with unusual clarity, that I did not want to lose. The comms crackled. Kale's voice steady as a floor. He was on the bridge. He had gone there without being summoned, which I noticed, and he was speaking to Hres in the clipped, precise language of someone who had done this before. He was describing a defensive pattern using the ship's structural geometry that I would not have conceived of, using the Sorath Ven's curved interior walls as deflection channels rather than open corridors, creating bottlenecks at the points where the ship's natural architecture already narrowed. He spoke for 90 seconds. Hres did not interrupt him. When he finished, she said, without any particular warmth but with complete decisiveness, that they would do it his way. The breach came from 2 points simultaneously: port docking clamp and the maintenance airlock on the starboard lower deck. They had the ship's layout. They knew exactly what they were doing. What they did not know was that the ship's interior had been reorganized in the previous 40 minutes by 8 Zirathi officers and 1 human who had memorized the entire vessel. I watched on the cameras. I had promised myself I would not watch, and then I was watching, because refusing to see something is not the same as it not happening. Kale was at the starboard position, which was the secondary entry point. He had 2 of the ship's officers with him, and they held the lower corridor for 11 minutes against 6 raiders, which should not have been possible by any tactical calculation I could run. He read the situation the way he seemed to read everything, continuously and precisely, adjusting before the adjustment was obvious, creating advantages out of angles and timing, and the particular way that he did not do what a trained opponent expected him to do. He went down in the 8th minute. I saw it on the camera, a hard impact against the corridor wall that dropped him to 1 knee. My hands went still on the desk. My chest did something I did not immediately classify. He got back up, not slowly, not after a moment of recovery. He got up the way a wall comes back after something hits it immediately and completely. And he continued and the corridor held. By the 15th minute, all 4 breach points had been contained. 2 raiders had escaped back to their ships, which were now retreating at speed. The others were secured. Press's voice on the intercom was composed but different in a way I could not describe precisely. A careful kind of different. As if she was holding something she had not expected to be holding. I was already moving. My kit was in my hand before I had consciously decided to take it. I was out of the lab and in the corridor and walking fast, and I told myself it was medical responsibility. It was the same professional duty I had performed after the first attack. It was exactly the same. It was not exactly the same. He was sitting on the corridor floor, which was becoming a pattern that I noted with an uncomfortable tightening in my chest. There was blood on the side of his face from a cut above his ear, and he was breathing harder than the last time, and he was holding his left side with 1 arm. I crouched beside him, and I did not say anything about the blood on his face because there was nothing productive to say about it. I assessed him. The cut was superficial, the ribs were bruised, possibly fractured, not structurally dangerous. The plasma burns on his forearms were older than this encounter, and he had not mentioned them. I treated the burns on his arms first because they needed to be treated first and not for any other reason. He watched my hands. He did not look at my face. He was giving me space to do my work without making it into something it was, in my log, not supposed to be yet. When I finished the forearms, I moved to the cut above his ear, and I had to be close to do it. Close enough that the bioluminescent markings on my temples were visible in the low amber light, and I saw him notice them. Most humans had a reaction to the markings, ranging from open staring to studied avoidance. He simply looked at them for a moment, with the same quiet attention he gave everything, and then he looked at my hands again. I cleaned the cut. I held the closure strip against it. I was aware, with an acuity that was scientifically inconvenient, of how close I was to him, of the warmth that came from his skin even through injury, of the steadiness of him even now, even sitting on a corridor floor with blood on his face. That same practiced stillness that I had learned over weeks was not absence of feeling but management of it. He said quietly that the archive was intact. I said yes. I told him the encryption had held and the data was safe. He said good. He said it like someone saying the most important thing first. I finished the closure strip and sat back and looked at him, and something that had been building in me for weeks arrived at the surface without warning. I did not plan what I said next. If I had planned it, I would not have said it because I do not say things I cannot fully justify. I said that I had been wrong about him. He looked at me then, the first time he had looked directly at my face for more than a moment in the entire conversation. And his expression was not surprised, but it was careful. The way you are careful with something that might be fragile. I said that I had put him in a category before he arrived on this ship, and I had kept him in it regardless of what he actually was, and that this was intellectually dishonest, which was not something I was supposed to be. He was quiet. He did not say that it was fine, that he had not noticed, that it did not matter. He did not perform generosity. He sat with what I had said and let it be what it was. Then he said that categories were useful until they weren't, and that knowing when to discard them was the harder skill. I looked at him for a long moment. The amber lights were still on. The ship was settling back into itself around us. The sounds of a crisis ending, the quiet machinery of recovery beginning. I said that I was going to file a request with the High Matriarch. He waited. I said that I was going to ask to re-enter the continuance program, and I said that I was requesting a specific donor. I said it without softening it, without making it more or less than it was, because that was the only way I knew how to say things that mattered. He looked at me for a long time. The corridor was very quiet. Then he said, "All right, just that, all right." Not as capitulation and not as ceremony. As a person deciding something alongside another person, which was exactly what it was. I stood up and told him to come to the medical bay in the morning. He said he would. I walked back down the corridor and I did not look back, not because I was indifferent, but because some things need a moment to simply be true before you look at them directly. I filed the request that night. The matriarch's response came back in 4 hours, which was faster than any council response I had ever received, which told me that she had been waiting for it longer than I had been ready to send it. The approval was 1 line. I wrote in my personal log for the last time that cycle. The entry was 5 words. I did not change my mind. I finally made it. My daughter is sitting across from me as I write this, which is to say as I tell her this, because I have been telling her this story for the last hour, in the way that Girathi mothers sometimes tell the truth to their children, out loud and fully, without the protective softening that love sometimes makes us reach for. She is 9 years old. She has my bioluminescent markings which glow the same cold silver as mine when she is thinking hard, which is most of the time. She has her father's eyes, which are the color of shallow ocean water in early morning light, a color I spent a long time telling myself I was not cataloging. She asks more questions than any child I have encountered, which the teachers at the learning center find exhausting, and which I find correct. She never flinches at information she does not like. She simply files it and continues, which is both my trait and his, arrived at from different directions. She asked me this morning to explain the old logs. She had found them in my archive, the way children find things you have not hidden, through attention and persistence, and the specific bravery of not knowing what you should be cautious about yet. She had read the earliest entries, the ones from before Kale arrived on the Sorath Ven, and she had come to me with the particular look she gets when she has questions that she suspects might be important ones. She asked why I had refused. I looked at her for a moment. This small person with her silver markings and her ocean eyes and her notebook always open, who has her father's habit of writing things down with physical pens. I thought about all the ways I could answer that question. I thought about the answers I would have given at different points in my life. Each one technically true and each one progressively more complete. I told her the full version, the one I have been telling her for the past hour. She listened without interrupting, which she can do when something has her full attention. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that it sounded like I was afraid. I said yes. I told her that I had been afraid of wanting something I had been ordered to want, because when you want something freely, and you have also been commanded to want it, you cannot tell anymore whether the wanting is yours. And she, not yet 10 years old, nodded once as if this made complete sense, which it does. But it took me 2 years and one extraordinary human to understand it. She asked where her father was. I told her he was in the back garden. She could hear the low sound of his voice through the window, which meant he was on a call with the council diplomatic office, which he did every Thursday morning. Because after the Sorath Ven, after the recovery and the reports and the formal review that followed, the council had asked him to stay on as a permanent liaison to the Girathi research program, and he had agreed. He told me later that when they offered it to him, he had thought of the view from the observation deck at the stern of the ship, the way the star systems passed at a particular hour of the evening, and he had decided he was not ready to stop paying attention to it. I did not tell him that he was the reason I had begun paying attention to things in a different way. I did not tell him with words, but he knew. He is very good at knowing things without being told, which is one of the things I have never put in a scientific log, because science does not yet have a clean language for it. The continuance accord produced 47 children in its first cycle. The second cycle is currently active. The enzyme marker study I filed on that long amber night became the basis for the revised hollowing treatment protocol that 7 of the leading geneticists across 3 species have now built an entire field of research around. The hollowing has not been cured. I want to be honest about that. We are not a civilization saved. We are a civilization buying time carefully and deliberately and with help, which is not the triumphant conclusion that stories usually aim for, but which is, in my scientific assessment, far more honest. Commander Hres requested a human military advisor 8 months after the Sorath Ven incident. She submitted the request under an operational security justification with 3 pages of tactical analysis attached to it. She told no one why she had personally reviewed 47 candidate profiles before selecting one. I did not ask. Some things deserve the privacy of not being examined too closely by someone who understands what she is looking at. Elara finished her doctoral work last year. Her dissertation was on the sociological factors affecting cross-species integration outcomes in joint research programs. She dedicated it to the crew of the Sorthven, which made me feel something I recorded in my personal log as professional pride, and which was, in fact, considerably warmer than that. My daughter has gone out to the garden. I can hear the two of them talking, her rapid questions and his patient, even answers, and the occasional sound of her correcting him when he gets something wrong, which she does without hesitation, and which he receives with a quiet amusement that never diminishes no matter how many times it happens. She wins at every cricket game he has taught her with a consistency he calls suspicious and I call genetics, and he laughs every time I say it, which is one of my favorite sounds in any language I have learned. I close the old logs. I keep the new one in a different format than I used to, less clinical, more honest. I have learned, slowly and with considerable resistance, that precision and openness are not opposite things, that you can be exact and still be fully present, that cataloging something and caring about it are not incompatible, and that knowing the name of a thing is not the same as understanding what it means to you. I refused a human. I was so certain of my refusal. I had built it out of pride and principle, and a fear I had dressed in better clothes and called philosophy. And then the universe sent a quiet man with old scars and a physical pen, and a way of paying attention to things that rearranged something in me that I had believed to be permanent. I thought for a long time that what changed between us was that I had seen what he was capable of, that the corridor held during the first attack, and then the second, was what made the difference, that the data of his actions was what revised my conclusions. But that was not it. That was part of it, but that was not the heart of it. The heart of it was the question he asked in the briefing room, the first morning, when I had just finished listing all my protocols and my restrictions and my careful professional distance, when a different person would have asked about their quarters or their schedule, or what they were and were not permitted to do. He had asked about the hollowing. How long had it been affecting the primary age group? Not because it was the polished diplomatic question, not because it showed deference or intelligence or tactical awareness, though it was all of those things, but because it was the real question, because it was what actually mattered, because he had walked into a situation involving a civilization's survival, and his first instinct had been to understand what the loss felt like, not to position himself within it. That was the moment. I did not know it was the moment then. I know it now. I did not change my mind about anything. I made my mind up, perhaps for the first time, about the things that counted most, and the difference between those two things is everything. Outside, my daughter is laughing. The sound of it comes through the window and lands in this room like light. I leave the logs closed and I go outside.